everyone! Welcome to the Jayda InStitches show. Recently I've been repainting some of our old wooden furniture, and as much as I love the fresh coat of paint and how light and fresh and airy it all looks, now I'm worried about protecting the surfaces of them. So I've been kind of on a personal mission to make myself table runners for our sideboard. I just did one of those a couple weeks ago, and now I thought maybe I'd try my hand at making some sweet little shelf liners just for the little things. I have this one small shelving unit. We're not really sure where we're going to place it yet, and it's got a cupboard and it's got two open shelves, and I just thought a couple of sweet little crocheted lacy looking little liners would be pretty because we're not really sure what we're going to put on that shelf just yet, and also it will help protect that pretty white finish. I have used the Primrose stitch for today's shelf liner, so I will explain to you how you can make it really, really long if you wanted to make a table runner, or really, really short if you wanted to make, I don't know, something else, maybe make it long-wise instead of width-wise. And of course you can repeat that simple little Primrose pattern until the piece is as deep as you want. This has so many uses. If you didn't want a shelf liner, maybe you'll consider making some placemats with it. And I've added that little petal border to it. Same border we used on our garden wall hanging that we've been working on. And it's just such a nice little way to finish off a piece. It's really pretty. It's got old-fashioned cottagey vibes. I just love it. So that's what I'm stitching up today, and I'm going to take you all along with me. Let's grab our hooks, grab our yarn, we'll head on over to the craft table, and we will stitch up a sweet little shelf liner together. In order to make our sweet little shelf liners, I'm using some True Boo by Lion Brand. This is a bamboo, 100% bamboo or rayon from bamboo, size 3 yarn. It's very silky, it's very soft, and I think it would make a really nice little shelf liner because it's smooth and it's not going to grab anything. I'm going to need about 100 yards of this, so I should be able to get 2 out of 1 ball of True Boo. Pair of scissors, yarn needle, and I'm using a G6 or a 4mm hook today for today's little tutorial. And I feel like that's a good fit with this size 3 lightweight yarn. Once you've got all that together, we can get started. The Primrose stitch can be worked over any foundation chain number that is a multiple of 3 plus 2 extra chains on the end for turning. The foundation chain determines the width of your project, and every 6 chains at this weight of yarn and this size of hook will give you about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters of width, and that's 2 little motifs worth. So for every inch you need in width of project, chain 6. As you're planning out your foundation chain row, remember we are adding a border. Our little petal border will add at least 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters to each edge of your little shelf liner. So whatever your foundation chain number is, if you're going for a specific measurement, go for 2 inches less than what you ultimately need because the border will add an extra inch to every single edge. So each side of your 4-sided piece gets an extra inch or 2.5 centimeters. So for example, I want a 17-inch wide shelf liner, so I am chaining 77 in order to get a base piece that is 15 inches wide. So 75 is my multiple of 3 plus 2 extra chains on the end for turning. I am chaining 77 to begin. Once you've chained your foundation number that is any multiple of 3 plus your extra 2 chains for turning at the end, for me that's 77, we start with an odd row, row 1, which is a Pico row. So we skip the first 2 chains from the hook, and into the 3rd chain we are going to create a Pico. Picos for the purpose of this project are a single crochet, chain 2, single crochet, all into the same chain or stitch. Skip 2 chains, find the next chain, and work a Pico. Single crochet, chain 2, and single crochet all into the same chain. Nice and easy. Skip 2, find the next chain, and work single crochet, chain 2, single crochet all into the same chain. Skip 2, find the next chain, single crochet, chain 2, single crochet, all into the same chain. And every 3 chains you will have a new picot. So you work a picot into the 3rd chain all the way along. Single crochet, chain 2, single crochet, all into the same chain, skip 2, picot into the next chain. And you're going to do that all the way along your foundation chain row. At the end of your foundation chain row, you work your last picot into the 3rd last chain, you skip 1, and you end that row with a half double crochet in the last chain. So technically this row begins with a chain 2, you work a picot into the 3rd chain. Every 3rd chain along you work a picot, and then you skip 1 chain and work a half double crochet into the last chain. So the chain 2 at the beginning of the row equals a half double crochet, and this little row ends with a half double crochet as well. For every 3 chains in your foundation row, you will have a picot. So at the end of my first row, I have 75 little picots. And once again, that ends with skip 1 chain, half double crochet into the last chain. At the end of an odd row, or the end of a picot row, chain 3 and turn. The chain 3 at the beginning of an even row counts as a double crochet. Even rows are all shell stitch or double crochet. Into the middle of every picot, so that little chain 2 space in the middle of every picot, you're going to work 3 double crochet to make 1 shell. So 3 double crochet equals 1 shell. You're just looking for the little picot bumps all the way along. Just pull it apart a little bit, or stick your hook right through the middle of it, and you can sort of, if you pull up a bit, you can see it. There's the little chain 2 space. You're going to work 3 double crochet into it. Once you get 1 double crochet into it, you can really see it. It opens up nicely for you. Don't be confused by the big open chain space beneath, which is what your picot was built into. It's pulling up on your foundation chain. But if you make the odd little mistake and you work your first row of shells into the wrong place, don't worry. For every picot, though, from your first row, you want to have a shell. So if you, like me, you had 25 picots in row 1, you will have 25 shells at the end of row 2. You're going to have the same number of motifs all the way throughout this little piece. So if you started with 75 chains like me, you had 25 little picots at the end of row 1, which means you'll have 25 shells at the end of row 2, and every row of picots will be 25, every row of shells will be 25. So that number doesn't change as you work your little shelf liner. And like I said, the way you can figure that out is for every 3 chains in your foundation row, so excluding those extra 2 turning chains at the end, for every 3 chains in your foundation row, you will have 1 picot or 1 shell. So work 3 double crochet into the little chain 2 spaces in the middle of your picots all the way across, and I'll see you at the end of row 2. When you get across to the end of an even row or a shell stitch row, the last thing you do is work 3 double crochet into the middle of your last picot, and don't forget there's this tiny little chain 2 on the end. So your little chain 2 turning, you want to find the top of that chain 2, get a piece of it, and double crochet into the top of it. So it'll be easier to see on successive rows, but you don't want to miss that last double crochet. So 3 double crochet into the middle of the chain 2 space of your last picot, and then immediately into the top of the chain 2 right next to it, you're going to double crochet. So the row begins with a chain 3, which counts as a double crochet, and it ends with a double crochet. And you've got 1 3 double crochet shell in the middle of each picot all the way across. For me, that's 25 shells. Every even row or row 2 ends with a double crochet in the top of the chain 2. Then you chain 2. That chain 2 counts as a half double crochet for your odd rows or your picot rows. Turn, and you start to work a picot or single crochet, chain 2, single crochet into the top of the middle stitch of each shell all the way across. Or skip to the middle stitch of the first shell you made, work a picot into the top of it, single crochet, chain 2, single crochet. So that's your shell. There's the middle stitch right here, and I've worked a little picot into it. And for the rest of the row, if it's easier, you can just skip 2 stitches. So skip, skip, find the third, which will be the middle of a shell, and work a picot into it. Single crochet, chain 2, and single crochet, all into the same stitch. So your picots are all directly in the middle of every single shell, which are directly in the middle of every picot from the previous row. So this way, all of your motifs are going to line up as you work through this little project. So here's your next shell, there's the middle stitch, and right into it, I'm going to work single crochet, chain 2, single crochet, and then repeat. Skip 2 stitches or find the middle of the next shell, single crochet, chain 2, and single crochet. So middle of the shell gets a picot, and that's what you do all the way across for every odd row. Picots sit directly in the middle top of each shell from the previous row. At the end of every odd row or picot row, you're going to find the top of the chain 3 after you finish your last picot in the top middle of the last shell. Find the top of the chain 3 and half double crochet. So remember, the odd rows begin with a chain 2, which counts as a half double crochet, and they end with a half double crochet. That's because the picot is sort of a shorter little motif. The even rows, or the shell stitch rows, all begin with a chain 3. So we're turning into an even row. Chain 3 counts as a double crochet. Turn your work, and you are looking for the middle of each of those picots. So the chain 2 space in the middle of the picot, and you work 3 double crochet or 1 shell into the middle of each picot. So if you had 15 picots in row 1, you had 15 shells in row 2. If you had 15 shells in row 2, you had 15 picots in row 3. I had 15 picots in row 3, so I will have 15 shells at the end of row 4, and so on. Your odd rows begin and end with a half double crochet. So chain 2, turn for an odd row, and it ends with a half double crochet. That's your little picot stitch. Your even rows start with a chain 3. You work 3 double crochet in each picot all the way across, and the even rows end with a double crochet. So chain 3 to begin an even row, a double crochet to end the even row. Then you chain 2, which counts as a half double crochet, turn, and picot into the middle stitch of each shell all the way across, ending with a half double crochet in the top of the turning chain. So you're always putting your last stitch of the row into the top of the turning chains, whether it's the chain 3 that began an even row, so you put a half double crochet into the top of the chain 3, or it's a double crochet which goes into the top of the chain 2, which begins those odd rows. And you're just going to alternate between the picot row and the shell stitch row, picot shell, all the way up. For about 9 inches, I'm going to work 24 rows. Again, I want to be 2 inches or 5 centimeters under my target of 11 inches total, because I'm going to be adding that little petal border, and the petal border will add 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch to all 4 sides of my piece. So I will be working until row 24. You can continue to alternate this stitch as many times as you want, but I recommend, if you want to include the petal border, like we're doing today, that you end on an even row or a shell stitch row. That way the petal border will be a lot easier to put into place. And with that said, I'll let you continue with that. I'll see you at the end of row 24. I have completed 24 rows of the Primrose stitch, and I have ended on a shell stitch row, which I recommend you do, regardless of how many rows you want to do in total. I recommend for the purpose of this pattern and adding the petal border that you end on a shell stitch row. It just makes putting on that first row of the border easier. We are going to start with a chain 1 at the end of our last row. We're going to turn. We're going to work the first foundation row of our petal border back across what was the last row of our Primrose stitch before we go down the first side. So into that first stitch you're going to slip stitch, chain 3, and slip stitch all into the same stitch. So your corners will all have these little chain 3 bubbles kind of sort of sitting out to the corner. If you find it difficult to see because you're using, a really small hook and thin yarn, you can add a little stitch marker to your corners. That will make them easier to see. We are going to chain 3, skip the next 2 stitches, and slip stitch into the next stitch. Chain 3, skip 2 stitches, slip stitch into the next stitch. Chain 3, skip 2 stitches, and slip stitch into the next stitch. You're going to do that all the way across. Chain 3, skip 2 stitches, slip stitch into the next stitch. And you're just creating little chain 3 spaces all the way across the last row of your Primrose stitch. Those little chain 3 spaces will look like they're sitting directly on top of each of your shells. When you get across to your last shell, you'll be looking at your 3 double crochet of your last shell and the top of your chain 3 that was your turning. You're going to complete your last chain 3, skip 2, slip stitch, and you're going to chain 3, skip over your entire last shell, and slip stitch into the top of the chain 3 that began that row. Now we're going to treat this like a corner, so we're going to chain 3 and slip stitch back into the exact same place, and that is our second corner completed. So that's a little chain 3 bubble right on the corner. Again, you can mark it with a stitch marker if you find it helps. And now we are going to focus on the edges of our Pico or our odd rows. So we're going to chain 3, skip the edge of a shell stitch row, find the edge, the half double crochet or the chain 2 that was alongside an odd row or a Pico row, and you're going to slip stitch into that. Chain 3, skip the edge of an even row or a shell stitch row, find the edge of the next odd row or the Pico row, and slip stitch into the edge of that half double crochet or chain 2. Chain 3, skip the even row, find the next odd row, slip stitch into the edge of it. And that's what you're going to do all the way down. So your chain 3 spaces are now sitting alongside your double crochet shell stitch rows. So that chain 3 or double crochet that began the row, you skip it and you slip stitch into the edge of the row beneath it or each odd row. And you're going to do that all the way down. The last chain 3 you do, we'll skip over your first row of shell stitch, which was row 2, and you're going to slip stitch into the edge of what was row 1, your first row of Pico. And that brings you down to your foundation chains. So this one with the little short tail attached was foundation chain number 1. We're going to chain 3, slip stitch into that foundation chain, and don't worry if it's a little bit big on you, that'll eventually disappear once we weave in our tails. You can rotate your work now so that you're working along the bottom of your foundation row. And this is what we want to do. We want to chain 3, skip 2 chains, and slip stitch into the next chain. So it's the same pattern that we did across the top. Chain 3, skip 2, slip stitch into the next one. Chain 3, skip 2, slip stitch into the next one. And for me, that winds up being the chain that is just before the one that is kind of created by the sort of the big space created by having made the Pico in the first row of our work. So I want to skip 2, and slip stitch into the next foundation chain. So chain 3, skip 2, slip stitch. Chain 3, skip 2, and then slip stitch into the next one. And it's actually the foundation chain that's just before. So 1, 2, just before the big space that's created by having made the picots in row 1. Chain 3, skip 2, and then just before the space made by that Pico in row 1, that's where I'm anchoring. Now, to be perfectly honest, there's a lot of flexibility here. All you want to make sure you're doing is getting the same number of chain 3 loops running across the bottom of your piece as you had across the top. So if you had 25 chain 3 loops, like I did, because you had basically one across the top of every single shell across the top, plus your 2 little corner bits, you'll have 25 chain 3 loops in between your corner loops running across the bottom. So as long as you can fit in the same number of chain 3 loops across the bottom as you had across the top, you're good to go. When you get across to the last foundation chain, you've finished what you should have pretty much the same number, exactly the same number of chain 3 spaces created across your bottom as you do across the top. Your last one is chain 3, slip stitch into what was the kind of the bottom of the chain, the turning chain, and then chain 3, rotate your work, and you're going to skip up to the edge of what was row 1. So that's the edge of your first Pico row. And that creates your little corner. So you should have 25, or I should say however many you of chain 3 spaces you had across the top, you should have the same ones running across the bottom. You're going to anchor that little chain 3 corner in the edge of row 1. And then it's just like the other side, chain 3, skip the even or shell stitch rows and slip stitch into the edge of the odd rows. And you should have the same number of chain 3 spaces running up this side as you did over on your other side. I had 24 rows in my piece, so I have 12 chain 3 spaces running up the edge of my square, my little liner here, because you are basically anchoring these little chain 3 spaces every other row. Your last chain 3 will be anchored in the top of the last stitch of your row, of your primrose row. So basically right where your first little corner bubble was made. So chain 3, slip stitch into the same place that you began the corner row, the whole sort of chain 3 foundation row for your border. If you're off a little bit here and there, don't worry about it. The whole point of this border is that it's a cute, bubbly little edging, and it's only 2 rows. So if you do make any errors, they're really not going to show, because now we're just going to create little petals. So right from where you are, you're going to slip stitch into the chain 3 space. So now we're only worried about chain 3 spaces. There are no corner specialities, nothing fancy to do for the rest of this little border. You chain 2, double crochet into the chain 3 space, so try to get the chain 3 space, chain 2 and slip stitch into the chain 3 space. So the smallest ones are going to be the corners. There we go. Let's turn and work across the top. So identify a chain 3 space, slip stitch into it, chain 2, double crochet into the chain 3 space, chain 2, and slip stitch into the chain 3 space. And this is what makes a little petal. Find the next chain 3 space and slip stitch into it. Chain 2, double crochet, chain 2, and slip stitch all into the little chain 3 space, and that gives us our little petals all the way across. Slip stitch into the chain 3 space, chain 2, double crochet, chain 2, and slip stitch. You will do that in every single chain 3 space, including the corners, all the way around, no exceptions. So you'll have a little petal in all 4 of the little chain 3 corner spaces. So don't miss your chain 3 corner spaces. Like I said, if you needed to, just mark them with a stitch marker so you know they're there. If you made it the same number of shells across as me, you'll have 25 across the top, 25 across the bottom, 12 along each side, and 1 in each corner. So remember, you'll have the same number across the top as you do across the bottom, you'll have the same number across each side, and we all have 4 little corners. Every chain 3 space gets that petal. Slip stitch, chain 2, double crochet, chain 2, slip stitch into every single chain space. And I will see you all the way back around at the beginning. After you've anchored your last little petal in your last chain 3 space, just slip stitch back into the same place that you began the row in, just to sort of tidy things up, and then you can fasten off. Weave in your tails. If you're using really slippery yarn like I am, cut an extra long tail so that when you're weaving it in back and forth, it doesn't want to come undone on you. This particular yarn is very, very slippery. So I want to make sure that I'm weaving it in underneath relatively tight stitches, and I'm weaving it in back and forth several times so that it doesn't want to come undone. Once you've woven in your tails, you can opt to block it, maybe do a little light steaming or a little light wash and block, and just let it lay completely flat to dry so that it's in the shape and size that you want it for your little shelf. A sweet little shelf liner. Or if you wanted to, you could use this pattern to make it into placemats or a table runner. I would just use a slightly stronger cotton for that. Anything in a high traffic area needs something that will hold up to a little bit more wear and tear. So like a mercerized cotton, like the 24/7 cotton we used for our summertime table runner a little while ago, that's a good one for placemats and table runners. But if it's going to be in a not so high traffic area, then this Trubu is really soft, silky stuff. I really like working with it. So soft. I could see why you might want to wear it. I might want to wear that shelf liner. Anyway, if you'd like to pick up a copy of today's written pattern, you'll find it over at our Etsy shop. Link is in the description box down below. And while you're there, click on Message Seller and send us a photograph of anything you've made. We are happy to share photos that you've sent us, anything you've made of our tutorials over on the community tab of our channel homepage here. So we have a community tab, part of our channel. If you click on the name Jayda InStitches, it'll take you to the home page, the YouTube homepage, and then you can click on community and you can see all the photos that we share of all of the things that you guys have made with our tutorials. And we are happy to do that, and it's really fun. I love seeing what everybody does. Everybody chooses different colors and uses different sizes and has a different mind, something else sort of in mind for the project. It's just so neat to see that in all those different situations. Very inspiring. Anyway, have a wonderful rest of your week, everybody. Stay safe, stay crafty, and we'll see you soon. Bye, guys.
Hi, everybody. Mr. InStitches here. Thank you for watching today. Here are some of our other videos you might be interested in. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe.